All right, welcome back, everyone. We are honored to hear the keynote address from GNSI Executive Director, General Frank McKenzie. During his 4 decades in the Marine Corps, he commanded at the platoon, company, battalion, Marine Expeditionary Unit, and component levels, leading Marines on multiple deployments. Served our nation for 42 years, retiring in April in 2022 as Commander of United States Central Command. He's now the Executive Director of the Global National Security Institute, as you know, but also for the Florida Center for Cybersecurity at USF. And he also recently authored The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. That book and other books are for sale and available right outside in the break area. It's my distinct honor to welcome General Frank McKenzie.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you here today. Beautiful, beautiful Florida day out there. These conferences always work really well in February and March here in Florida. We get a lot of attendance, which is great. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to talk a little bit about what I observe as some lessons learned from the 3-year war that's been fought in Ukraine, build on some of the remarkable input from the first panel, and I thought both panelists were just really good, and Tad did a very good job of drawing them out. And so I'm going to talk about a few things, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. And I'm delighted to take your questions. And what I always say at times like this is I really do like getting the questions. You're not going to embarrass me with a question. I'm a 4-star general. There's no internal monologue of inadequacy or insufficiency here. So I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. So, but let me just sort of ease into this a little bit. We're just past the third anniversary of this war. The war began with the invasion by Russia, as we're all aware. I'm not going to review all the antecedents to the war. Some of that was very ably done by the prior panel, and some other people today are going to do it, so I'm not going to talk about that a lot. I think Putin's remarkable speech of the 21st of February 22, which some of you may remember, sort of laid out a Russian rationale for why they did it, and that's worth going back and taking a look at just because of the shocking nature of the speech and what he actually says. But it sort of, at least to me, sort of gave you the sense of why he invaded, and a view really of bringing Slavic culture together under an imperial Russian empire, Belarusia, Ukraine, and the sort of the indivisibility of those peoples is sort of behind what he did. So that's one explanation that seems to work for me as I sort of think about it and try to understand what Putin was thinking about. As I think of the war in Ukraine, I think of it in 3 phases. The first phase, the first year really, was a mobile war. Low force density, as we would say, high mobility, and well-equipped forces fought. And just hold that thought for a minute. The second year, the forward line of troops, what we would call the FLOT, the front line, stabilized. There were 2 major breaching attacks, both of which failed, one by Russia, one by Ukraine. And the introduction really began in the first phase, but you saw it in the second, the introduction of large-scale mine warfare, the indiscriminate use of mines, both mines that are put in by human beings and also mines that are mechanically deployed either by artillery or aircraft or other things. So you see a lot of that. Also, you see from the first to the second phase, drones were used in the first phase. They're increasingly used in the second phase. But as you go from the second phase to the phase we're at now, you're going to see what I would call the democratization of drones. They're now able to be built very cheaply, and the drones that are flying now are very different than the drones that were flying on day one of the war. So the phase we're in now, this is an attrition phase. Breakthroughs are less likely and really less important than causing casualties. And so the front has stabilized. It is more like Passchendaele in World War I than it was in some phases of World War II. The equipment is far more mixed. The Russians, has already been noted, they started the war with about 2,800 main battle tanks. Some of those tanks are very good. T-80, T-90, AT-4, those are good tanks. Now they're pushing T-62s into the fight. Let me tell you, the T-62 was old when I was commissioned. That's an old tank. And in fact, they're talking about T-55s and T-54s. Those are very old main battle tanks. And it shows you the degree of equipment attrition. And I'll actually call that out as one of the lessons. There's all kinds of different equipment disparities. And that's not only true for the Russian side, it's also true to some degree on Ukraine's side, because the problem the Ukrainians have is they're supplied by many nations in many types of equipment. You never want to mix a German tank and a U.S. tank in a tactical formation if you can avoid that. It's just they don't work well together. The equipment's they don't match. So that's a Ukrainian problem. The other characteristic of this phase of the war is, although it was there to a degree, the fight has become deeper in that both sides, Russia was always able to reach into Ukraine, but now Ukraine is able to reach into Russia, and they've actually begun to do that to a greater degree. So that's sort of the characteristics overall of the war that we had now. I'd like to take a minute to just talk about how the war began in intelligence. And the first panel dealt with it, I think, very well. As has been noted, we had very good intelligence on Russian intentions and Russian plans. In fact, it was as good as you could ever see. I was on active duty during that period of time, so I was in a position to know exactly what we had and exactly what we were thinking about doing. You may recall that Ukrainian leaders had to be convinced of the pending Russian attack to some degree. They didn't want to believe that the Russians were actually going to do it. So the president made a decision to declassify a lot of highly sensitive intelligence information. And it's not so much the information that is sensitive, it's how you got it. It's what we call sources and methods. You're very protective of how you got that information, because sometimes it involves human intelligence. Sometimes it involves technical measures that we don't want to share or don't want to give away a secret. But we made, and I think it was actually a good decision to share the information that we had. And by that, we can infer that was voice communication, people talking. It was pictures of Russians going to their pre-jump-off attack positions, a variety of things. We also shared it with Russia, so they would know that we knew and that they were not going to be able to do this in secret. The intent was to deter Russia from attacking. So quite an intelligence coup and a comprehensive failure of U.S. policy. And why did our policy fail, and why were we unable to convince the Russians not to attack? A lot of reasons. Some of those reasons were discussed earlier this morning. I'd add one more to it, and that word would be Afghanistan. Because you had an administration that appeared to be weak and feckless, that had turned, cut and run from Afghanistan, that had no credibility, at least from Putin's perspective. No credibility on the world stage, had shown they were not willing to stand by their friends and partners, and had badly bungled a withdrawal from another country. So I think, again, I go back and say, reflects a failure on our part, that we laid ourselves by what we actually, by the reputation that we enjoyed post-Afghanistan. Now, we repaired a lot of that, I think, to some degree in the months that followed. But nonetheless, at a time when we really wanted to convince Russia, no, we know what you're going to do. We have a very good idea of what you're going to do, and we're sharing this with all our friends and partners. They chose to believe that we would not actually do anything if they attacked. And of course, ultimately, we did some things. We did some nuanced things that I'll talk about, but we did not understand. We were not able to change Putin's mind. Now, there is another failure of U.S. intelligence, though. We got their plan right. We did not understand Russian capabilities. We were completely wrong on Russian capabilities. The Russian army's attack was much weaker and uncoordinated than we had assumed, and that's really a profound failure of intelligence. We had studied. I spent the first 10 years of my military career studying the Russian army in great detail, from 1980 to when the wall came down and we began to do other things. But I had a profound grasp of Russian capabilities. I always had great respect for what Russia had done, and we always felt that the Red Army, the Russian army that followed it, would fight pretty effectively. We were wrong. And it turns out the Russian army was and still is a rotten force. By rotten, I mean its internal cohesion is not good, its leadership is not good, and it typically underperforms. And so why is that the case? And I would argue that it's cultural. And the culture is this. The Russian army doesn't have the captains, the majors, the staff sergeants, and the sergeants that make the U.S. Joint Force happen. So it is difficult for someone to give an order and believe it's going to be carried out. It's difficult for a private soldier, in a Russian formation, to believe that his lieutenant's actually going to be with him when the fight occurs. The lieutenant may be sleeping somewhere else, may not even be with the formation. So it's a very difficult way to build a military and go to fight with a military. And I would also argue Ukrainian military to some degree displays those characteristics because, of course, it was a Russian model force. Not as much, and has been influenced by interactions with NATO, interaction with the West. So it's not that, but there are still some elements of that in the Ukrainian story. So I would tell you two things, sort of call this out and tell you why we should have seen it. The first story will tell you why we should have seen it maybe. And the second just illustrates the point I'm making. First, about 10 years ago, up north of the Arctic Circle, off the island of Novaya Zemlya, which is a big island up there. The Russians do a lot of elaborate testing of different things up there, mainly nuclear. They lost a nuclear submarine. I am not talking about the Kursk that happened in 2000. I'm talking about a completely different episode. This was a deep diving submarine, a small miniature nuclear submarine that was designed to dive to depths of 10,000 feet or more to grapple with undersea cables and cut those cables. Typically, it'd be taken to the objective area on a big submarine, a Delta 3, and then deployed to go grapple with our cables. It sank in an accident, mishap. 15 people died on the submarine. So here's the thing. Everybody on the submarine was a Navy captain. Why is that important? Because if a U.S. submarine of that size would have had a lieutenant commander skipper, a lieutenant engineer, and everybody else would have been a young, highly trained enlisted sailor. The fact that they did not have that force tells you the nature of their problem. They don't have that young force that's technically savvy and that's willing to go out and do the work. Everybody was a senior leader. That's bad news. And I was on the joint staff when that happened. I remember reading about it. We should have maybe drawn a little more from it than we did at the time. But just a good example, because that's a good example of the problems that the Russian military has. Second one would be that happened during the war was the armored attack on Kyiv. You remember this early in the conflict. They pushed a huge package of armored vehicles down the road to try to go and link up with. They were going to put an air landing force into the airfield, as has already been discussed, and they were going to push this armored formation up. Well, the armored formation ran up the road in single column, and it ran out of fuel. And so I cannot tell you how incompetent that is. I wasn't always a four-star general. I was once a captain and a company commander, and I had tanks that worked for me. In a U.S. main battle tank, an M1A1 has to be refueled every 8 hours. It runs on a gas turbine engine. If you don't refuel that tank, it's going to stop running. Every moment of your life, when am I going to fuel those tanks again? You think about it. We're very good at it because it's inherent to the nature of our professionalism to do that. So we got all kinds of ways to do it. Our tanks are refueled. We move. Our NATO allies do it. And there was once a time when the Russians did it too, but not now. And so the other thing is the complete lack of imagination in the plan. At one time the Russians, a guy named Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Vladimir Triandafilov, two brilliant Russian generals from the 30s. Tukhachevsky was purged by Stalin in 36 or 37, was rehabilitated by Khrushchev in 56. But Triandafilov wrote a book called The Nature of the Operations of Modern Armies. I have that book on my bookcase right now in my office. It's about deep operations theory. The Russians set the operational framework for how we fight today. Everybody thinks we got it from the Germans. Actually, it's the Russians. Deep operations theory, the way the U.S. fights, lifted from interwar Russian thoughts. However, that does not appear to have translated into the Russian army of today. I'm just trying to lay a little groundwork for why it was surprising that it failed. The other point, though, anytime I talk about the Russian army and how bad it is, I'm reminded of the example of Finland. On 30 November 1939, Russia invaded Finland. Not unlike for the reasons they invaded Ukraine, because it once was a duchy of Russia. They fought a war of several months there, and they got beat up pretty good. The Finns fought well and bravely. It was on their home turf. The Red Army was an invading force. When it was all over, they signed a treaty about 4 months later, and Finland ultimately ceded a fraction of Finland to Russia. But what came out of it was the impression of the bravery of the Finns, A, the incompetence of the Red Army, B, and people saw that. And a guy that saw that in particular was Adolf Hitler. And he drew some conclusions about how the Russians would fight. So that probably, to some degree, there were a lot of other considerations, but it factored in the decision to launch Operation Barbarossa the third week of June, 1941. Three years later, in the summer of 1944, that same incompetent Red Army is chewing the Germans apart and just ate them alive. One of the great military operations in history, Operation Bagration, in the summer of 1944, fought on ground not far from where Ukraine's fighting right now, destroyed Army Group Center and paved the way to Berlin. The Russians fought, and they fought brilliantly and bravely, and the Russian army in the Second World War was as good as any army that's ever existed. I think the main reason why, though, and for me another takeaway is why they are not fighting well in Ukraine, they were fighting on their own soil. The Great Patriotic War, actually, Stalin resurrected it for a lot of reasons, some hackneyed, some really transactional, but it was the Great Patriotic War for the Russians, and they fought and fought well. Tad said you can't, one of my favorite quotes is, it's hard to understand why soldiers fight. Soldiers fight for the ground they're on if they're defending their country. The Russians that are going to fight in Ukraine are not fighting to defend their country. Even they can't be programmed enough to believe that. So the fighting heart of the soldier still is very important. I would argue that the Ukrainian soldier is fighting very bravely and has a fighting heart. It's harder to inject that into the Russians. As for the North Koreans, they're fighting okay, but they're just being pointed at an objective and being told to go there. And I don't think there's going to be enough of them to change the tone of the fight. So at any rate, just something to think about, and something I think about when I think about the Red Army or the Russian Army and why it hasn't performed well. And I think it's important to understand the history of it. Sometimes we in the United States don't consider history when we think about things. The Russians actually do, and our European partners do to a far greater degree than us. So some observations based on that sort of framework that stand out to me. There are about 10 of them here. I'll read them. They're not in any necessarily any order. Number one is the sheer volume of ammunition that has been expended. The scope and scale, we grossly underestimated what a major war would require. And that's in terms of everything like very simple things like 155 artillery rounds, air defense missiles, anti-tank missiles, mortar rounds. All of those things, we vastly underestimated the amount required. And to our credit, the United States' credit, when I was on the Joint Staff, the chairman, a guy named Joe Dunford, some of you may know the name, we undertook a study because we felt we didn't have it right in terms of what the industrial plan of the United States could deliver in a major war. And we looked at a North Korea scenario. Simply assume a war in North Korea, stays in North Korea. We don't have to fight anywhere else in the world. And what we found was that war would eat the joint force up. It would eat us up. It would eat all our precision munitions up very quickly. Go down to dumb munitions. It would vastly eat into our stocks. Well, that's not the biggest scenario you could fight. So we actually had some knowledge of this, but now to see it here is very significant. The other thing that is part of this, and I'll call it out now, and I may mention it later, it's what I call the democratization of production of drones. You're now able to make drones in sort of like family cottages, cottage industry, if you will, in a way that you don't need a big factory. You can make them small, and they can be very effective at the tactical level, not at the operational level, but at the tactical level. But the second point is the concepts of air superiority and air supremacy that are fundamental to the United States view of war, I think are now invalidated by the use of drones. In my own theater in Central Command, we had drones overfly our bases all the time. If you have air supremacy, that's not supposed to happen. You can't prevent that from happening. The technology is coming that might allow us to do that, but it wasn't there then. I don't think it's there now. So the idea of being able of owning the sky is actually far more fuzzy than it used to be. And it's not because of manned aircraft, although manned aircraft still fly. It's because of drones. Everything from the little handheld soldier-launched drone to an operational drone is flying at a higher level, which leads me to the next point, the ubiquity of surveillance. The panel talked about the transparency of the battlefield. I think that's exactly right. The drones are out there. They're going to see most everything. And the corollary to that is this. If you can see it, you can kill it. And hardening won't protect you. You got to move, and you got to have a low signature if you want to survive. So think about that. And that's huge difference for us in our thinking. The United States has big command posts, lots of downlinks to the satellites, high signature. Strangely enough, you go back to 1985 when Captain McKenzie was training to fight the Russians. We assumed we would never be able to use our radios because the Russians were very good at radio direction finding, and you get a mortar barrage from what we call the regimental artillery group or the division artillery group if you came up on the radio. So we knew how to fight in an environment like this. We trained to fight in an environment like this. We don't train that way anymore, and we're probably going to have to go back there and think about that. But the ubiquity of surveillance is actually very, very important. Another point, and this is my observation, and you might choose to disagree with it, it affirms Clausewitz's concept that the defense is the strongest form of warfare. It is inherently easier to defend than to attack. Now, Clausewitz also said the natural end of defensive warfare is surrender, so you don't want to take it too far, but it is the stronger form of warfare. And we've seen that played out again and again, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. My next point would be, to me at least, to hold ground, you still need infantry. And you need infantry that's going to be supported by artillery, drones, and digging in. Although I take the point that was made earlier that now sometimes, Russians are dying never seeing an Ukrainian soldier, which is good. That's the way you'd like for it to be. You don't need to come to close combat if you can kill them at standoff ranges. But so the definition of close combat is probably going to change a little bit too. But I would argue still to hold the ground, you actually need infantry. And that's going to become, that still, I think, is very, very important. The next point I'd make is the tank is not dead. Although it's going to change its form yet again to adapt, you need protected maneuver on the battlefield. What's protected maneuver? It's the ability to move infantry in protection against small arms fire and light artillery. And you need something that can do a breach. We talked about the failure of the breaching attacks. To breach, to go through a fortified position, is one of the most complex military operations that can be undertaken. You got to clear mines under enemy fire. You got to suppress the enemy. You got to push through it. It is extremely kinetic, dramatically kinetic to do that. Very difficult to do. We're pretty good at it, and because we train at it. But you got to have tanks to do it. You can't do it unless you have armor. You're not going to do a breach with infantry. You have to have armor to do that. Again, tanks have been threatened before. In 1973, in the Sinai in particular, the Israelis attacked ill-advisedly after the Egyptians got across the canal, in particular the ATG-3 Sagger. The suitcase Sagger was very effective in killing a bunch of Israeli tanks. So you learn how to fight again. You don't fight in tank pure formations. You fight with infantry, which protects you from the ATG, the anti-tank missiles. As we see now, tanks now that you see deployed in Ukraine have cages around them, so it's harder for drones to get to them. We've also been there before because we use that against RPGs. And you got to do some other things to try to reduce the signature of the tank. But the tank, despite being threatened, I don't think is dead. So this may be the most important lesson. What's clear to me, and I'm sure to everyone in this room, this is all about information. This war is all about sharing information. I'm going to confine myself to the tactical level, the war level, but there's higher levels of information as well. So getting that information, collecting it, making sense of it, and then acting. That's what you do. That's what a commander does. And the ability to do that is what all the drones are doing. You're trying to sense the battle space. You're trying to prevent the other guy from looking at you at the same time. You're trying to find where is he and how can I strike him. And it's all about sharing information. And that's something that's very significant. You need a lot of bandwidth to do that. In an electromagnetically denied environment, it becomes significantly harder to do that. You can get around that by flying drones that have fiber optic cable. We're seeing that. Unfortunately, your range limited then, and eventually you're going to run out of cable for that drone. It's only going to go so far. But that is a way to do it. And then the other thing that leads you to is autonomy. You build drones with increasing autonomy that can function when you can no longer talk to the drone. That conceptually is going to be something the United States is going to have to think about, because we typically still prefer or talk about having a man or a woman in the loop. We're not going to be able to do that. It's clear the future battlefield, we're not going to be able to do that. In fact, some potential foes of ours, the Chinese, are really looking at ways to not do that now. Because unfortunately, when you put a human being into this, you add seconds or minutes to the equation. Sometimes you don't have seconds or minutes to make a decision. And increasingly, we're going to see that. I don't think the battlefield is going to become drone v. drone, but I think you're going to see a further hybridization of manned aircraft are going to be accompanied by wingmen that are drones. Ground vehicles are going to be accompanied by wingmen that are drones, and infantrymen are going to be accompanied by drones on the ground and drones in flight as well. This is coming. And the ability to deploy that force in an electromagnetically denied environment is going to become increasingly important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. The other thing is medical systems. Regrettably, we were going to do a medical component to this. For a lot of reasons, we're not going to be able to do it in this conference. But what the United States has developed over the last 3 decades is a brilliant boutique system designed to ensure that a casualty gets to a place of definitive medical care in 60 minutes, the golden hour. That's not happening in Ukraine on either side. Much worse on the Russian side, I believe, but Ukraine struggles with it too. Why? Because the number of casualties. You can't do that. You're back to really the way casualty evacuation was done in the Second World War, which is a rigid triage system, moving people back, and you're not going to be able to do it often by aircraft because your aircraft are going to be vulnerable in a large scale conflict like this. You're going to have to move them on the ground, and sometimes you're going to have to delay getting them off the forward line on troops. This is a significant change. I don't know that we have studied it enough. And add to it in a future war, and I'll talk more about it in a minute, if it's a chemical war, and chemicals have been talked about in this war but not used, now you got to decon them all. And decontamination is something we used to be very good at. We're not good at it anymore. The Russians still train to it, I understand. I don't know how good they are at it. I know that they still have an offensive capability that we do not. So just something to think about as you think about lessons here. This is a really important point. The next point would be the weakness of Russian electromagnetic warfare at the beginning of the campaign was marked. I wish I were smart enough to know why it was bad, but what it has done is they have improved dramatically. And Russian they're very good now in the EM spectrum. I would have said, if you had asked me 1 February 2022 to say how good are the Russians in electromagnetic warfare, I would have said they're much better than us. And I still believe they are probably much better than us. But for whatever reason, they were not able to coordinate it effectively early in the campaign. They are now doing that. For example, our ATACMS, GPS enabled, have trouble because of Russian jamming. Other systems that depend on that have trouble because of Russian jamming. We didn't have those problems early in the conflict. The Russians are adapting. They had an opportunity to actually learn and change. The next point would be there has been no use of chemical, biological weapons in this, chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons in this war. The Russians have threatened it a lot. And we should know and understand the Russian approach to nuclear weapons is very different than ours. Anytime I talk about this, I recommend to any audience that you need to go read a 1977 article. And the article title is this: Why the Soviet Union Thinks It Can Fight and Win a Nuclear War. And it's written by a guy named Richard Pipes. You can get it right now. Google it and you'll get it immediately. It's still in print, still out there. And it is an excellent analysis about then Soviet thinking about nuclear weapons. And let me assure you, nothing has changed from 1977 to today. It remains the seminal article, at least for me, in understanding the Russian approach to nuclear weapons. They're a weapon to the Russians. To us, because I would argue we have the unique moral burden of having dropped nuclear weapons on human beings. The United States has a different approach when we think about nuclear weapons. The Russians are not burdened by that, nor the Chinese for that matter. So they tend to be more cold and clear-eyed when they think about the use of nuclear weapons. And the fact that they haven't used them in this war, I draw no particular comfort from that. They haven't used them in this war because he hasn't had to use them in this war. If he had had to use them, I believe he would have used them. And we can talk about that in the question and answer period if you'd like. So the other point I'd make, sort of overarching all of this, is the Biden administration was very active in trying to convince Russia not to attack. After the attack occurred, I would argue that from the United States' perspective, we tried to manage the war as something that we wanted to find some kind of settlement there. So we looked at it not as a solution where we were not seeking victory. I think somebody up here mentioned that actually, and I think I agree with that. We didn't seek it. The problem with war is, and again, I'm a shameless Clausewitzian. Wars tend to go more violent. They tend to grow out of control, and it's difficult to manage war. And sometimes from the purity of the National Security Council staff, it looks like you can manage it like a business case problem when you actually can't do that because it's a clash of naked human wills. So I would argue that we had opportunities early on in the conflict to give Ukraine significant equipment that might have put us on a very different path. We, the United States, chose not to do that. As you know, our European allies were a little more forward-thinking on this. We slowballed the M1s. We slowball the F-16s. Not that the F-16s would have been a solution. I just cite them as a couple of examples. But certainly DPICM, munition, cluster mine artillery, we should have given that to them much, much, much earlier. We chose not to do so for a lot of reasons, none of which were good in this context, I would argue. So that was a major factor, actually, in getting us to where we are today. The last administration's inability to see through to what they wanted. And again, it's been called out very, very neatly. What Putin wanted very clearly is victory. Well, he knew what he wanted, but anytime you have an asymmetry of goals, we want to draw, he wants a win, but you're at a disadvantage in a clash that is essentially a clash of human wills. So I would argue that's a major thing, and hopefully historians are going to look at that as we go forward. So I'll close out with just a couple of more tactical observations and then an overall observation, then I'll be happy to take your questions. So I've already made this point, but I'll make it again because I think it's absolutely vital. Tactical combat's increasingly going to become not uncrewed, but it's going to have a larger uncrewed component in every way. In every domain, we're going to see that. Second, we talked about the ability to process information remains critical. It's going to become increasingly challenged by jamming and other forms of disruption. And we need to recognize that. The next point is the scale of losses, human, material, as significant as any combat since the Second World War. And we have not been prepared for that. I think it has more of an impact on Europe than it is here in the United States because it's a long way away from us and we choose to not view it as an existential problem. The Ukrainians certainly view it as an existential problem. I think the Europeans are now becoming to view it more as an existential problem. But we don't recognize the vast scale of losses. And what that means is you have to have the ability to generate new forces. And Ukraine is struggling to do that. Russia's struggling more to do it. And as I noted, Russian tanks, Russian equipment, Russia is in trouble. This is not going well for them. So they're not in a particularly good place. So I'll just finish by saying this. How important is the United States to this? This is my opinion only. I don't believe NATO can face Russia and Ukraine without the United States. You can disagree with me if you like. I think we remain the indispensable nation. And I believe if we pull out, not of NATO, but pull out of Ukraine, and we choose not to support NATO's efforts there, it will be very hard for NATO to do that. The second thing, I don't know how NATO holds together as an organization in its current form if the United States should choose to exit. I have no indication that we're going to do that, but I would note that it is indeed a unique organization. Look, I'm an internationalist. If you're the CENTCOM commander, 39 nations represented down there on the compound, 21 nations in my region, you have to know how to do business with other nations. And I believe the United States is always better when we're allied or linked with other nations when we pursue a purpose. That's my philosophical perspective. But more broadly right here, I think it's an important thing. And I think if we withdraw from Europe, it will be a bad thing. And so I always look for historical analogies, and I look at when Wilson came back after Versailles in 1919 to try to sell the Senate on the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. And he was unable to do that. And the United States essentially looked away from Europe. We looked inward. And as a result, many bad things happened over the course of the next 20 years that ended up fighting another global war. 1941, as far as we're concerned. It actually started in 1933, as most of you know. But we fought a large global war because we turned away. We had an opportunity perhaps to be part of that before it got to that stage. We waited, and we had to fight the Second World War. So it concerns me. It concerns me that we're at this stage right now. I think the next 30 days are going to be very important. We will discern what this administration's views are going to be. I was chatting with a friend earlier. I mean, the mineral deals in Ukraine could be a factor here that we haven't seen fully fleshed out, how that could play going forward. It could be a way to back into something, always possible. And can NATO put something together? My experience is it will be very difficult for NATO to put something together. Probably not impossible, but very difficult for them to do that. So, while Russia is in trouble militarily, economically, in every way they can be in this fight, they've got to see it. They got to see themselves as being at a moment of opportunity now, just as I think NATO and Ukraine have to see themselves at a moment of heightened risk. depending on what the United States does. So thanks very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions that you got.
This one here. We good? Okay. Some questions. Got about a little under 10 minutes for some Q&A. While NATO's expansion near Russia and adversarial military buildup near China seems similar, how might Xi, dadgummit, my computer locked up, how might Xi view Taiwan differently or similar than Putin viewed Ukraine?
So I think but both, strangely enough, I think China's on a little bit of a timeline because I think they're concerned about where they might be economically in 20 years, where they're going to be with their population in 20 years. So when we talk about China having being a huge economic engine, it's not an engine that runs without risk, and they face that risk. So I think Xi is actually under some pressure maybe to deliver. The one thing I do know about China and Taiwan, I'm not a China-Taiwan expert, but I spent a lot of time looking at them while I was on the joint staff. If China ever decides to go into Taiwan, the last living Chinese soldier will be put on the last surviving Chinese landing craft and launched across the strait, because it will be a matter of physical survival for Xi if he can't pull it off. So we should know that if China actually ever starts a military campaign, they'll be all in. That would include, I would argue, the use of nuclear weapons, and they'll be willing to do that. So we should just know, I think that's their thinking. Now, there may be more sophisticated ways for them to attempt to capture Taiwan, hybrid war, economic blockade, just a variety of more sophisticated ways than a direct military attack. But I think what Xi is probably learning from what's going on there is he's going to be most worried about what is the United States going to do? What is the United States reaction going to be? So he's trying to calibrate what our reaction, what we do with Ukraine. People draw analogies. It's the way people think. Listen to me. I've drawn a bunch of analogies up here because it's the way I think. He's going to do the same thing. What do they do with Ukraine? They cut a deal? Do they run? What do they do in Afghanistan? All those things, I think, are going to factor in. I'll give you an example. Until recently, I would have said that actually the fact that we've been able to stand up a large coalition against Putin was very concerning to China. So now a crack has appeared in that, and he may see it in a more positive light. But I think, again, Xi drew lessons from Afghanistan about American fecklessness and weakness. But he had to recalibrate then when we cobbled together a pretty good coalition to actually stand with Ukraine, even though, as I've noted, we limited what Ukraine could do. So now I think he's waiting to see what the end state's going to be, and I think that's what will draw his lessons.
The previous panel did talk about China and Taiwan, but then looking towards the Middle East, what lessons may be drawn by Iran regarding any desire to be a regional hegemon?
So Iran is a regional hegemon and is going to be a regional hegemon. We're not going to make Iran go away. Iran's been around for thousands of years, before the beginning of the Common Era, in fact, and they're as a nation, they're not going to go away. So we need to know and understand that. Now, the form of government they've got right now is atrocious. Its human rights record is terrible. We all know the things it does. So we can all hope that can change, and that may change. But Iran is not going to go away. I would say this, and I don't want to get too deeply into an Iran discussion, but Iranians are rational within their belief structure. And the number one priority for Iranian leadership is preservation of the regime. They view it as a revolutionary regime. The task of a revolutionary regime is to stay alive, pass it on to the next generation, which is now happening, and to export the revolution, which they also do. So that's task number one. Task number two is destruction of the state of Israel. Task number three is ejection of the United States from the region. Tasks 2 and 3 will never challenge task 1. So Iran is going to see what happens here. They're going to look to the United States because they know that we will drive what happens in that region toward them. And so I think the next 30 days, 40 days or so, they'll have a lot more clarity on what end state is going to, because I don't think we know yet, actually, the Trump administration's end state on Ukraine. I just don't think we're there yet. It's a messy process, an ugly process, but I don't think we're there to a final position. So we should have that within the next month, and that will also inform the Iranians.
What lessons learned from the Ukraine-Russia war that could be possibly applied to the Arctic, a future conflict area?
Sure. So Russia needs access to the Arctic for a lot of reasons. Geographically, they're better positioned than us to get up there. They're the Northern Fleet stationed up there around the North Cape east of Norway. So the Arctic is very important for them. It's also very important to us, particularly as the polar ice cap begins to melt and transportation lines of communications become more readily accessible across the Arctic. So beyond that, I would hesitate to draw any. We're in competition with Russia right now up there. Sometimes effectively, sometimes not effectively. In order to compete, you actually have to have ships that can go up there. We actually struggle with that. The Russians don't. So if you're going to build, you got to build icebreakers if you want to go up north and you want to compete in that domain. And so there's some things we need to do in terms of force design if you want to get up there and compete.
There's going to be a panel later about technology in warfare, but I did, while you're up there, sort of ask about the importance potentially of AI in future warfare.
So we talked a little bit about it, but in a denied environment, an environment that you might be in a nuclear war, a trans strike, what we call a trans strike period or a post strike period, you're not going to be able to communicate. So at any kind of level, so your battlefield systems are actually going to have to be able to do some thinking for themselves. And that my position on that has changed over time. I used to several years ago, I would have been all about man in the loop all the time. I just don't know that we have the luxury of that. As ethically attractive as it might be, I think if we put human beings into the process, you go from milliseconds to minutes, and that's a trade you may not be able to make. Additionally, again, in a denied environment, you're not going to be able to communicate. You may not be able to communicate with your drone, so the drone may have to think for itself. Your systems may have to be able to perform basic functions without communication or even interconsciousness among a drone swarm. So I think it's going to be a very muddy picture, but AI is coming. We just need to control it so that it serves our purposes and we don't serve its purposes.
Can the Russians, assuming no peace deal, can the Russians, Ukrainians continue the fight as it currently goes? And if so, how long?
So we just, unless Russia gets relief, they're struggling. If you're wheeling T-55s off and pushing them up to the flight, that's not a good tank. You don't want to be the guy riding in a T-55 going up there to fight the Ukrainians. So Russia has, I think, unless they get relief, and they may get relief politically, diplomatically, then I think they're in trouble. And I think the timeline's limited. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a problem that's not dissimilar. They're fighting on the defensive. They're still going to get equipment from NATO, regardless of what the United States does or doesn't do. So I think time here actually works more against the Russians, just from a combat perspective. From a political perspective, too soon to tell. I mean, the recent events have really perturbed it. So I'm not sure how that's going to end up. But I think Ukraine is now far more at risk.
And basically, time for one more question. Kind of switch it to a different region with considering Russian strategy. How will the Russian retrograde in Syria post-Assad affect Russian strategy?
So I don't think the Russians are going to leave Syria. I think they want to keep their little base because they like having a couple of Kilo submarines that can operate in the Eastern Med against the Sixth Fleet. So I think they're going to try very hard to reach an accommodation with the incoming government to allow them to be there. I think, I've heard different noises. They're going to require them to, not have air defense systems, do a variety of things. And most of those things, I believe, have already left. The Russians need them in other places. So I think the Russians will stay in Syria. Maybe not the air base. Maybe they'll keep the air base. They'll probably try very hard to keep the port. It'll be a smaller footprint. Look, the Russian presence there was never huge. We could have crushed it in an afternoon had we chosen to do so. But it was there to throw sand in our gearbox to demonstrate support to one of the few, maybe the only ally you got overseas if you're Vladimir Putin, and to show that you're a factor on the world stage. Well, some of those things are now sort of OBE. So I think they will. It's really the long objective for them. Really, is just to have something in the Med where they can actually have ships down there. I know there's talk about Libya and other places, but the Eastern Med's better. That base is not a bad base, and we operated the Cold War the whole time with Russians in and out of that port. It never stopped us. I don't see it as a huge threat if the Russians stay, frankly. Thanks. Thank you.